Hello guys, welcome to our channel Learn with Rahul. So today we are going to talk about Pride and Prejudice. So before I start, I have a request for you guys. Please subscribe my channel and press the bell icon. Your subscription will be a big motivation for me. So let's start. Pride and Prejudice is an 1813 romantic novel by Jane Austen. It charts the emotional development of the protagonist Elizabeth Bennet, who learns the error of making hasty judgments and comes to appreciate the difference between the superficial and the essential. The comedy of the writing lies in the depiction of manners, education, marriage, and money during the Regency era in Britain. Mr. Bennet of the Longbourn estate has five daughters, but his property is entailed, meaning that none of the girls can inherit it. His wife has no fortune, so it is imperative that at least one of the girls marry well to support the others upon his death. Jane Austen's opening line, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a simple man in possession of good fortune must be in want of a wife," is a sentence filled with irony and playfulness. The novel revolves around the importance of marrying for love, not simply for money, despite the social pressures to make a good match. Pride and Prejudice has long fascinated readers, consistently appearing near the top of list of most loved among literary scholars and the general public. It has become one of the most popular novels in English literature, with over 20 million copies sold, and paved the way for many archetypes that abound in modern literature. For more than a century, amateur and professional dramatic adaptations, print continuations and sequels, and film and TV versions of Pride and Prejudice have portrayed the memorable characters and themes in the novel to reach mass audiences. The 2005 film Pride and Prejudice, starring Keira Knightley and Matthew McFadden, is the most recent Hollywood adaptation of the book. Now let's talk about Jane Austen. Jane Austen, 16 December 1775 to 18 July 1817, was an English novelist known primarily for her six major novels, which interpret, critique, and comment upon the British landed gentry at the end of 18th century. Austen's plots often explore the dependence of women on marriage in the pursuit of favorable social standing and economic security. Her works critique the nobles of sensibility of the second half of 18th century and are part of transition to 19th century literary realism. Her use of biting irony along with her realism, humor, and social commentary have long earned her acclaim among critics, scholars, and popular audiences alike. With the publications of Sense and Sensibility 1811, Pride and Prejudice 1813, Mansfield Park 1814, and Emma 1816, she achieved success as a published writer. She wrote two additional novels, Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, both published posthumously in 1818, and began another, eventually titled Sanditon, but died before its completion. She also left behind three volumes of juvenile writings in manuscript, a short epistolary novel, Lady Susan, and another unfinished novel, The Watsons. Her six full length novels have already been out of print, although they were published anonymously and brought her moderate success and little fame during her lifetime. A significant transition in her posthumous reputation occurred in 1833 when her novels were republished in Richard Bentley's standard novel series, illustrated by Ferdinand Pickering and sold as a set. They gradually gained wider acclaim and popular readership in 1869. 52 years after her death, her nephew's publication of a memoir of Jane Austen introduced a compelling version of a writing career and supposedly uneventful life to an eager audience. Austen has inspired a large number of critical essays and literary anthologies. Her novels have inspired many films from 1940s Pride and Prejudice to more recent productions like Sense and Sensibility 1995, Emma 1996, Mansfield Park 1999, Pride and Prejudice 2005, and Love and Friendship 2016. Now let's talk about the summary of this novel. So let's start. The novel opens with Mrs. Bennet trying to persuade Mr. Bennet to visit Mr. Bingley, a rich and eligible bachelor who has arrived in neighborhood. After some verbal sparring with Mr. Bennet, baiting his wife, she believes he will not visit. A little while later, he does make the visit to Netherfield, Mr. Bingley's rented house, much to the delight of Mrs. Bennet and her daughters. The visit is followed by an invitation to a ball at the local assembly rooms that the whole neighborhood will attend. At the ball, Mr. Bingley is open and cheerful, popular with all the guests, and appears to be very attracted to the beautiful Miss Jane Bennet, with whom he dances twice. His friend Mr. Darcy is reputed to be twice as wealthy. He is haughty and aloof, and his manners cause everyone to turn from interest to a decided dislike of him. He declines to dance with Elizabeth, stating that she is not pretty enough to tempt him. She finds the amusing and jokes about it with her friends. Mr. Bingley's sister, Caroline, later invites Jane to visit. When Jane visits Miss Bingley, she is caught in a rain shower on the way and comes down with a serious cold. Elizabeth visits the ill Jane at Netherfield. There Darcy begins to be attracted to Elizabeth, while Miss Bingley becomes jealous, as she has designs on Darcy herself. Mr. Collins, a cousin of Mr. Bennet and heir to the Longbourn estate, visits the Bennet family. He is pompous and obsequious clergyman who intends to marry one of the Bennet girls. When he learns about Jane and Mr. Bingley, he quickly decides to propose to Elizabeth as the next in both age and beauty. Elizabeth and her family meet the dashing and charming George Wickham, who singles out Elizabeth and tells her a story of the hardship that Mr. Darcy has caused him by depriving him of a living position as clergyman in a proper, pro, prosperous parish with good revenue that once granted is for life, promised to him by Mr. Darcy's late brother. Elizabeth's dislike of Darcy is confirmed. At a ball at Netherfield, Elizabeth reluctantly dances with Mr. Darcy. Other than Jane and Elizabeth, several members of the Bennet family shows a distinct lack of decorum. Mrs. Bennet hints loudly that she fully expects Jane and Bingley to become engaged, and the younger Bennet sister exposes the family to ridicule. Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth, who rejects him, to the fury of her mother and the relief of her father. Shortly after, they received news that the Bingleys are suddenly leaving for London with no intention to return. After his humiliating rejection by Elizabeth, Mr. Collins proposes to Charlotte Lucas, a sensible young woman and Elizabeth's friend. Charlotte is slightly older and is grateful to receive a proposal that will grant her a comfortable home. Elizabeth is against at such pragmatism in matters of love. Heartbroken, Jane goes to visit her aunt and uncle Gardiner at an unfashionable address in London. There it becomes clear that Miss Bingley does not want to resume their friendship, and Jane is upset. Though very composed, in the spring Elizabeth visits Charlotte and Mr. Collins in Kent. Elizabeth and her host are invited to Rosings Park. the imposing home of Lady Catherine de Broch, patroness of Mr. Collins and Mr. Darcy's extremely wealthy aunt. She expects Mr. Darcy to marry her daughter. Mr. Darcy and his cousin Colonel Fitzwilliam are also visiting at Rosings Park. Colonel Fitzwilliam tells Elizabeth how Mr. Darcy managed to save a friend from a bad match. Elizabeth realizes the story must refer to Jane and is horrified that Darcy has interfered and caused her sister so much pain. Mr. Darcy has fallen in love with Elizabeth and proposes to her. She rejects him angrily, stating that she could not love a man who has caused her sister such unhappiness, and further accuses him of treating Mr. Wickham unjustly. The latter accusation angers Mr. Darcy, and he accuses her family of lacking propriety and suggests he has been kinder to Bingley than to himself. They part on bad terms. Later, Mr. Darcy gives Elizabeth a letter explaining that Mr. Wickham had refused the living he claimed he was deprived of and was given money for it instead. Wickham proceeds to waste the money, and when impoverished asked for the living again. After being refused, he tried to elope with Darcy's 15-year-old sister, Georgiana, for her large dowry. Darcy also writes that he believed Jane, because of her reserved behavior, did not love Bingley. Darcy apologizes for hurting Jane, and Elizabeth begins to change her opinion of Mr. Darcy. Some months later, Elizabeth and her aunt and uncle Gardiner visits Darcy's estate in Derbyshire, Pemberley, after Elizabeth ascertains that the owner will not be there. On a tour, Elizabeth hears the housekeeper describe him as being kind and generous. When Mr. Darcy returns unexpectedly, he is exceedingly gracious and later invites Elizabeth and the Gardiners to meet his sister and Mr. Gardiner to go fishing. Elizabeth is surprised and delighted by their treatment. She then suddenly receives news that her sister Lydia had eloped with Mr. Wickham. She tells Mr. Darcy immediately and departs in haste, believing she will never see him again since Lydia's disgrace has ruined the family's good name. After an agonistic wait, Mr. Wickham is somehow persuaded to marry Lydia. With some veneer of decency restored, Lydia visits her family and tells Elizabeth that Mr. Darcy was at her wedding. Mrs. Gardiner informs Elizabeth that it is Mr. Darcy who made the match at great expense and trouble to himself, and hints that he may have another motive for doing so. Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy returns to Netherfield, and soon Bingley proposes to Jane and is accepted. Lady Catherine, having heard rumours that Elizabeth intends to marry Darcy, visits Elizabeth and demands that she promises not to accept his proposal. Elizabeth refuses to do so, and the outraged Lady Catherine leaves. Darcy, heartened by Elizabeth's response, again proposes to her and is accepted. Elizabeth had difficulty in convincing her father that she is marrying for love, not position and wealth, but in the end Mr. Bennet is convinced. So that's all for today, guys. I hope this video will be helpful for you. Give a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Your subscription will be big motivation for me. So that's all. Love you. Take care. Bye. Over and out.